Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners, from Los Angeles to Long Island, make the second half of life even better than the first. In an age driven by science and technology, Dr. Stephen G. Post is a rare blend of scientist and humanist, a best-selling author, and transformative speaker who has inspired thousands of people with his profound work on giving behavior. As we look forward to Thanksgiving, Stephen Post will begin today's episode by talking about the life-enhancing benefits of giving. Give and live better, says Dr. Post, who is the lead author of Why Good Things Happen to Good People, How to Live a Longer, Healthier, Happier Life by the Single Act of Giving. A growing body of research shows that when we give of ourselves, everything from self-satisfaction to self-realization and physical health is significantly affected. Depression is reduced, well-being is increased, mortality is delayed. Beyond his broad research on giving, Stephen will talk about a particular kind of giving, caregiving. The author of the recently published book, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, How Caregivers Can Meet the Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease, he has earned international recognition for his acclaimed work on bioethics and compassionate care for people with dementia. Currently, Stephen is director of the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics at Stony Brook University School of Medicine in New York, a place where the human side of medicine is elevated, examined, and revered. He also serves as the president of the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love, which he co-founded with philanthropist Sir John Templeton. Indeed, there has always been a spiritual side to Stephen from the start, and his life work blends an extraordinary exploration of positive psychology, altruism, love, happiness, and the mystery of the human mind. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce our guest, Stephen G. Post. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. I could not be more pleased than to be sharing this time with you.
Yes, and I am pleased too. We've had several conversations, and I'm delighted to keep our conversations going. Now, you've had really an extraordinary career, Stephen, and it covers a lot of ground. But rather than try to retrace that ground, I'm just curious. Your current position kind of says it in terms of the range of your interests and expertise. So I'm just interested. Were there any like pivotal moments in your life when you realize, aha, okay, this is not going to be a traditional career. I'm
Oh,
going I'm going to be blending a lot of things and going from, journey to journey and strand to strand, stream to stream.
well, I've always been shockingly open-minded, and I like to see the connections. I think analogically more than in a linear fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So I see how that connects with this, and it's been my style of mind. I think most problems in today's world can't be resolved by kind of narrow linear thinking. It
Mm-hmm.
requires a lot of interdisciplinarity and thinking about things from very, very different perspectives, and exuding an attitude of appreciation and tolerance. So that's always been my MO, and I've been happy with it.
Yeah, yeah. It's I guess, visually for me, it's what they call mind mapping, right? You start putting one thing here and then it connects to another thing and another thing here, and you start connecting the dots, and pretty soon you've got the whole brain with all those connections, neural connections between the different, issues and problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've never been siloed. That's what I would say. I've never been a silo person. A lot of academics are caught up in their little discipline, and they'll trot out one or two more papers a year on Jonathan Edwards in 1742. Uh,
Right.
but uh, I've always been crossing the boundaries, doing medical humanities in medical schools, uh, being a scientist, but also being a humanist and a poet and a popular writer. I've been involved at the interface of science and philosophy and religion, and therefore worked very heavily with Sir John Templeton for many years, setting up so many of his great visionary projects. So I've been very lucky, and Stony Brook's been a good place for me because they have more than tolerated me. They've actually embraced my style,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been able to connect with all kinds of clinicians and medical students. In fact, we have more students in our area of scholarly concentration in the class of 25 than even basic science and research. So it's very impressive. I think it's a tribute to the students here who know that healing is more than responding to disease, but it's responding to the illness experience subjectively considered. And
Right.
so therefore a kind word can go a very long way.
Right.
And gentle curiosity can save a person's life.
Right. Right. So let's we'll get into some of this, especially your work with Sir John Templeton later. But I did want to let's start since we are looking toward Thanksgiving this week. It's not your most recent book, but it's one of your important books. When good things happen to good people, and you cite some great examples of simple acts of giving, and so there's obviously a psychological dimension, but there's actually a physical dimension that you describe in terms of it actually improves people's health. So talk a little bit about your thoughts about giving behavior.
Sure will. And gratitude, by the way, is a form of giving. When you
Mm-hmm.
offer thanks, it is somewhat routine, but it can also be very altruistic and very generative and very uplifting for people. Not that everyone needs an expression of gratitude when they're contributing to the lives of others, but it can be beneficial for them and it can spark their energies. But giving, Sir John always said way back in 1990 uh, that love heals.
Mm-hmm.
And he believed that the great secret of life is the golden rule and its positive formulation,
Mm-hmm.
not the minimal negative formulation. Don't do unto others as you would not have them do unto you, which means you can go home tonight. And if you have not elbowed some innocent person in the ribs, you can feel great about yourself. No, more idealistic version, do unto others. So use your minds and your creativity to figure out how you can best contribute to the people around you. And I live that way. I get up in the morning, usually about 5, and I meditate and visualize most of the people I know that I'm going to meet over the course of the day. I keep an old-fashioned notebook,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I ask myself, what do they really need? Well, some of them need some forgiveness because they've made a medical error. So I
Mm-hmm.
know they need me to tell them, well, those who make no mistakes make nothing, quoting Martin Luther King.
Right.
Or maybe some of them need some compassion because they've really been suffering over their wayward child or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them need what I call carefrontation, a term I coined with M. Scott Peck,
Oh
who
yeah.
wrote,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, who wrote The Road Less Traveled, because we didn't like confrontation because it's so divisive. But carefrontation means that you're going to be able to address waywardness when we leave really our core values and stray.
Mm-hmm.
Carefrontation allows us to be that velvet hammer in a loving form that brings people back on track and makes them appreciative and creates a kind of glue that sticks. So all those things, creativity, some people really need an idea about a paper. In fact, many of the medical students come in here and they have a wonderful idea, but they really don't quite know how to pull it off. So I spent a lot of time helping them with creative endeavors. And there are
Mm-hmm.
so many things. Forgiveness is an expression of love. So I don't think of love directly because it's a term that most people think of, well, they think of it, the love of designer jeans, the love of chocolate, and not so much the love of humanity.
Right. Right.
But it's all these manifestations of that commitment to the well-being and the security of those around us that people can easily connect with. Compassion, they easily connect with that. So
Right.
we have a center here that focuses on training in compassionate care and
Right.
empathy. Those are all very important aspects of what I would call an overall love philosophy, which
Right.
I've had since I was a kid in high school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned me before that there's actually a body of research that supports this, and it's not simply altruistic thinking. Um, it's something that actually does contribute to your health and longevity.
Yeah. So it's kind giving that's important. Emphasis kind.
Mm-hmm.
People give, people are altruistic, other regarding for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are pretty dry. Um, when you interview people like we do here who were 9/11 responders, it wasn't that they were doing that because of some profound empathic love, but because it was what they had to do, given that they were firemen
Mm-hmm.
or police. It was their role, it was their station, it was their duty, it was part of their job description, if you will. And so in the Navy they say, um, you never abandon a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, the other ways of thinking about this, for some, it's really a matter of uh, genetic impulse, just a
Mm-hmm.
kind of saving impulse that some of the genetics people say is kind of misdirected from the family unit to humanity as a whole, which is almost kind of a promiscuous diversion because
Huh.
you shouldn't be loving all people. But I think that the love that interests me and the altruism that interests me involves emotion. When my dad was in the Navy in World War II, and he was responsible for building the submarine net
Hmm.
across New York Harbor, which was down where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is now.
Wow.
And he got a wonderful letter from Frank Knox, who was Secretary of the Navy, congratulating him and commending him for jumping into the cold, icy waters of New York Harbor to save a worker who had fallen into the waves.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, as I grew up, I asked my dad, "So, did you ever visit him?"
Huh.
No, I said, "Did you ever talk with him? Did you really ever have much interest in him?" No, he said, "I was in the Navy, and that's what we do."
Huh.
And so it was a role altruism. But that's different than what we see in the clinical settings where patients really need to feel an affective or an emotional presence. And if they don't feel that, somehow they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel secure. So that's the kind of empathy and kindness and compassion that really helps us because it recenters us emotionally from anxiety and from concerns about self and the problems of the self. It shifts our emotional uh, mindset toward the other, and it involves the mesolimbic pathway in the brain. It involves the release of certain connecting hormones like the endorphins, but also others, which I won't go into. But the nice thing is that you really do get into a whole different frame of being, and it's very peaceful. It's very tranquil. It brings people into a state of joy. They talk about the helper's high.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not fretting about everything. Now you're in a better place, and that's a beautiful thing to do. And it does contribute to health and emotional happiness, and also even longevity to
Mm-hmm.
some degree.
Right. Right. So this is what you're really talking about in terms of compassionate care, right? This is sort of a description of, beginning of, because that's something I want to talk about more about, but this is the beginning of that discussion, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
what you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, and you're not just going through the motions. I mean, and I say this with a lot of sympathy for
Mm.
clinicians now because they came into medicine wanting to really be there and present for their patients. But you've got these things called revenue units
Right.
and chronological pressures all around. Plus, you've got to keep up with your medical records, which is almost a full-time job now. So they get frustrated, and they can be running on empty.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so when they're running on empty, it's very hard for them to have the kind of authentic compassion and empathy and listening that patients can pick up. Patients really do pick that up, and and it's so sad when someone who can be technically very proficient loses that beautiful quality. So we work with them and we give them tips and we do all kinds of exercises to help them maintain that and it's a very interesting process. But it resulted in us winning the Alpha Omega Alpha annual award in 2019
Mm-hmm.
for education in professional identity formation centered on compassion. That's a national award. It goes to one medical school a year, and
Hmm.
we got it.
Wow. Well, that's great. It is really important. And I do recall many years ago when one of my brothers who became an ophthalmologist and he joined a practice. And I remember in the early days, this was the beginning of sort of uh, well, corporate medicine, there was a lot of focus on revenue generation and sort of systemization and efficiency. And I remember I don't remember if it was when his residency or I thought it was, I think it wasn't a practice. Anyway, he said that one of his senior colleagues came to him and said, um, I think you're spending a little bit too much time with your patients. And he was like, "What? What do you mean? I mean, I'm trying to find out what they need, what the issue is. It's not always very easy. Like, what is actually the problem?" And I'll never forget that conversation and just recognizing, good for you, Larry. Good for you.
Yeah, yeah. I got a phone call last week from a cardiologist in Virginia who went through our MA program in medical humanism and compassionate care.
Hmm.
And he got the same message from his boss. You're spending too much time with patients. He was only spending 15 minutes max with the patient. But he said, this is what really matters to me. It's what really motivates me. And, I really implore you to let me do this in my own style. But he got a little bit of a kickback. So he's now looking around for another kind of place where he can really flourish. Because if people aren't working in an environment where they can flourish, they will hopefully move on, or else they will burn out. And all of our studies show that even in medical school, if you're identified by your peers as more empathic, you will not have the same problem with burnout down the road in residency or in future clinical practice.
Right. Yeah, this is really critical, and it's not easy. I recognize that there are constraints, there are demands. You set up schedule of seeing patients, and sometimes things happen. Consultations take longer than you expect, so you have patients waiting and getting irritated, and you're like, I'm sorry. We're doing the best we can. Things happen. You don't expect them. You've got to pay attention to the patient and to what their needs are. So,
Yeah.
it's not. I grant it's not always easy to do that. So,
But when you're looking at the wall, typing into a computer, and your patient is sitting there wondering what's going on, you just need to turn around, swivel around, and say, gee, I apologize ahead of time. I've got to focus in on this medical record right now, but
right,
I'll be with you more deeply in a minute.
right,
And that we teach the students to do that.
right,
We teach them many little tricks of the trade, like organizing their schedule. So in
right,
the morning, they get all the patients who they know just want to get in and out
right, right,
primary care. And then in the afternoon, they schedule the patients who really want to be there to connect
right. So,
and
so hold
create.
that thought. Hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break, Stephen. But when we come back, don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be coming back with much more from Stephen Post, the director of the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics at Stony Brook University. Welcome back, folks, to 45 Forward, where we're talking with Stephen Post, an international speaker, best-selling author, and director of the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics at Stony Brook University. Now, before we continue, I wanted to just mention that you can find out much more about Stephen on his website. That's just Stephen Post. That's STEPHEN post.com. Or you can go to my website, roelresources.com, and click on the 45 Forward tab, and you can see Stephen's background there and some references to some of his work and how you can get in touch with him. So, before the break, we were talking with Stephen about compassionate care and the impact on the patients and as well as yourself, the caregiver. So I wanted to just shift a little bit to a specific kind of caregiving that relates to his current book, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, How Caregivers Can Meet the Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease. Now, I think that November is one of the Alzheimer's Awareness Month, so we're right, in that area of thought about this issue. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about, Stephen, is the interesting term you say, dignity for deeply forgetful people. So talk about that term. How did you come up with that term? What does it mean?
Well, dignity means to hold in grace,
Mm-hmm.
not to be derisive, not to be demeaning. But really, the more unique term is deeply forgetful people.
Right.
So for 30 years, I've been working a lot with caregivers all over the country and all over the world. I've never felt comfortable, Ron, with the word dementia.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you just look at it structurally, it's about a decline, dementia,
Right.
from a former mental state. It reminds me of the word retard.
Right.
And we don't use that much anymore. We don't speak about people as retarded. We might speak about them as differently abled,
Mm-hmm.
possibly handicapped. And so I wanted something for this population that didn't just kind of separate them from us and there, but for the grace of God go I. I wanted something that emphasized a little more the continuities between their experiences and our own.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, in this medical school, on any given day, I may go out in the big parking lot and forget where I parked my car. And I have to ask a medical student, do you know where I parked my car?
Right.
And they may laugh a little bit. And then sometimes I'll say, do you know if I drove to work today? And that's a little more serious. But we all have these moments, and we're frustrated because we forget a name, and our short-term memory is not what we think it might have been once upon a time. That's perfectly normal. So deep forgetfulness suggests that, people with quote unquote dementia are a little more along on the spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
but we all experience forgetfulness, and sometimes it can be pretty deep and pretty surprising, and we're frustrated by it. But for sure, their experience is not completely different than ours, and also they still have all the other human attributes and qualities that you would consider fundamental to being a part of the human family.
Mm-hmm.
They have creativity. They're amazingly creative. De Kooning painted for 13 and a half years of his 14 years with Alzheimer's disease in his loft in Greenwich Village.
Mm.
And his work actually became more flowing, more tranquil, because I think he sort of forgot about the I don't do nothing for nothing attitude out there on Bleecker Street. I think he was disinhibited. I think a sort of inherent kindness in him was disinhibited. And that happens with these individuals. Sometimes it goes the other way. But for sure, they can be very creative. They can chime in on deeply learned music. There's a huge movement called Music in Memory.
Right.
A wonderful documentary video called Alive Inside that won every kind of award at Sundance. So I just think it's incredible. I was on the board for a while of the Memory Center in Brooklyn Heights, and they have Alzheimer's poets. So they'll bring in, 30 or 40 people who are deeply forgetful, and their heads are down, they're not communicating with their caregivers who's there. They call them care partners, actually, which is an interesting language as well. And when that poet or poets in the middle of that room begin to recite The Road Less Traveled with animation, with energy, with kindness, with musicality, like Robert Bly,
Right.
Suddenly these people will chime in. And as I witnessed it, 80 to 90% of them will chime in for a line or sometimes for a whole verse. And there are some who will just stand up and just recite the whole poem. And then afterwards, they'll be conversant for a few minutes. Then they'll go back where they were. But it's been totally inspiring for their caregivers because they realize, you know what? Grandma's still there. She's not a husk. She's not a shell. She's not empty. She's not dead. She's not gone. All those negative metaphors that the word dementia invites.
Right.
Right. And so I'm into deep forgetfulness as almost a mystical term. And you're a Yale graduate.
Right.
I'll tell you, I knew a great New Testament scholar at Yale who had a wonderful wife named Janet, and she succumbed to Alzheimer's disease. And for several years, she would float around the Yale Divinity School campus on Prospect Street, and
Mm-hmm.
people would guide her around and try to talk with her, but she got progressively worse. But when she went to the services on Sunday morning in the Yale chapel, she would identify with the music because that's the music she grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
She would identify with the colors in the stained glass window. She would identify with the prayers that she had been reciting since she was a young girl. You know, this is Leander Keck's wife,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, and she would chime into these beautiful hymns, and she came to life. Her emotions would become vibrant, and you could just feel her presence. And then afterwards, by many self-reports, she would be conversant with her old friends,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for at least, you know, 4, 5, 6 minutes. And then, okay, she would lapse back. But what happened is that everybody knew because they had seen it and felt it and
Mm-hmm.
interacted with her, that Janet Keck was still there, even though she was deeply forgetful. So she
Right.
wasn't that different from you and me anyway.
Mm. Yeah, so that's what you refer to as paradoxical lucidity. Is that the term you?
Yeah, yeah, I like the word paradoxical. That's another term I coined long ago, not meaning terminal lucidity, like end of life lucidity, which you sometimes hear about, but really that people who have not been communicative for a long while can suddenly surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
So I define hope in the book as being open to surprises. Okay.
Right.
I mean, I was doing a talk on deep forgetfulness at the Times Center in New York about 8 years ago, and there was a wonderful woman on a panel that followed who'd written a book about caregiving for her mother, and she emailed me a few days later, and she said, "I was thinking about what you said because yesterday my mother looked at me intently, and she said, 'God, physics, and the universe.'" And she was an MIT physics professor. Okay.
Uh-huh.
So you have to be open to these things and feel them. In New York, there's something called the Unforgettables Choir,
Hmm.
which comes out of NYU, and they have a great Alzheimer's center there. But they organize people around New York, caregivers and people who are affected by deep forgetfulness.
Right.
And you know, they'll join together and they'll do rehearsals of very meaningful, deeply learned music. It could come from Broadway, it could come from wherever, but they'll connect with it. And then in the process, they become more ambulatory, they become more affective and emotional and expressive, and it just brings them together. And it's just absolutely a miracle. So you have to always see. I went just one last comment on this. You
Sure.
know, I went to a nursing home in Chardon, Ohio, which is about an hour away from Cleveland. And I spent a lot of time at Case Medical School, 20
Okay.
years. And Joe Foley, a distinguished neurologist, and I went to this nursing home, and they had a special care unit for people with dementia. We read the bio sketch on the wall about a guy named Jim, and I asked the nurse to take us to Jim. We went over to Jim. I took him by the arm and we sat down. And I said, "Jim, how are your boys?" And he was agitated. He couldn't communicate verbally, but he seemed agitated. But then I asked him, because I remember from the bio sketch, "How's Jake and how's Danny?" And he just lit up. If joy was electric, he would have put the place on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was using language in a way to remind him
Right.
of these things. And so you have to learn how to communicate. And then he had a twig in his hand, which I'll never forget. It was a painted white twig, and it was rounded on the edges so he couldn't poke anybody. You know, it was pretty thick. And he put it in the palm of my hands. And he looked at me and he said, "God is love."
Hmm.
It turns out I didn't know what that possibly could refer to. I asked the nurse, what's the story with that twig? And she said that Jim grew up on a farm near Chardon, and his father, whom he loved very much, gave him one chore in the morning, which was to bring kindling in for the fireplace.
Hmm.
So Jim, like a lot of these individuals, he had gone back in time to that point in his life where he was experiencing tender, loving care.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's the power of love. And so you don't ever think that love abandons these individuals. They actually can be more sensitive to love and empathy and compassion and kindness than most of us are as we run around from point A to point B. And there was a rag doll on the floor. I'll end this little vignette here.
Yeah.
It was so beat up, it looked like it had been torn apart 50 years ago. And he ambulated toward it. He picked it up. And he went over into the corner and he put it on the lap of a woman who was crying in her chair. And she stopped crying. And I said to the nurse, so what's the story with that rag doll? It's one of those puppet dolls you put on your hands, a bear doll.
Oh, okay.
And she said, well, that's her doll. So look, Jim, he may have not been memory intact, but he had a lot of emotional intelligence.
Right.
More
Right.
so than a whole lot of people
Right.
in today's distressed world.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's something that we worry about. Communicating with those deeply forgetful people, and yes, there are issues about decision making and relationships between what's happening now, the past, the future, and the present. And people talk about, well, these people are in the present, and and that really is where most of us talk about where we should be. Right? We're always talking about be present, just be present, and these folks are present, and to appreciate that, and it does take some skill, as you mentioned. So you don't say to somebody, as you mentioned, like, how are your boys, and say to them, well, um okay, how does what boys, they have to make thoughts about who, what boys are you talking about, so you say specifically the names of these so they can respond to it. They're not trying to answer complex questions, but once that you get through that, you do um, appreciate their emotional state. There is a tremendous, as you put it, emotional intelligence, um, and it's a wonderful thing to appreciate, as opposed to always focusing in, okay, how do I manage this situation? And also, as you pointed out earlier, it is difficult, but I think we do spend a lot of time worrying about um, managing things and taking care of them, and not just being with them and appreciating how much they are like us. You know what I mean?
Oh, I think every caregiver should sing
Mm,
with their loved one. Just sing to them gently those songs that they so loved earlier in life, and just be open, because it's very likely that you will bring them back into themselves. They'll get somatic and rhythmic and connect with you and light up emotionally. And they may even have a few surprising words. So that's what you want to do, artistically, musically, in so many ways. There was a guy I described in the book who would come to an art class, and every day he had a black crayon and pad of paper. He'd just scribble around, but there was always a line down the middle of this pad of paper. And people would ask him, so what is this? And he couldn't respond. But then one morning, shockingly, he said, it's a map so my daughter can find her way to my house.
mm,
There you go.
right, right, yeah, yeah. I think that I do recall, one of my one of my brothers and I, with my mother. I've told this story before, but it's when she was deeply forgetful, and we would just sort of spend time with her. Um, we would one day my brother pulled out some of my mother's songs that she would teach us when we were young, and we didn't. I guess we sang, but there were a couple of songs that she sang to us in Spanish, and at one point, she said to us, "Well, I'm going to hold that thought because we're going to come to a break. But when we come back to the break, I'm going to finish this story
Please.
and explain what the connection was and the deep lucidity that came out from that moment. So don't go anywhere. We're going to take another short break, but we'll be talking much more with Stephen Post when we come back from the break. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with Stephen G. Post from the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics at Stony Brook University. Before the break, I was in the midst of a story. We were talking about lucidity, paradoxical lucidity, and I was talking to Stephen about my mom when we had one of these moments with a brother of mine when we pulled out some music that from a song that she taught us when we were quite small, and she hadn't been very verbal for quite some time, and it was a song in Spanish that she taught us. It was just called Parito Bello, pretty bird. And at one point in the song, it just says Parito Bello, negro y amarillo, which is pretty bird, black and yellow. And my brother and I, we sang a little bit of it, and then she sort of brightened up, and then, at a moment she just said amarillo, because yellow was one of her favorite colors. And, that's what I understand. The colors are still quite vibrant for those who are deeply forgetful. That's part of their emotional fabric. And as you mentioned, Stephen, music and colors, that emotional component to, I guess often they respond to being in nature, if that's what they.
Well, they love the fall leaves and the smell of an apple pie that might remind them of grandma's kitchen when they were kids. I mean, they're very much alive. I mentioned to you once upon a time that I had been in a town in India called Bangalore,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd been invited to the Indian Institute for Advanced Studies to do a conference on the deeply forgetful. And I was talking about how they can always respond to symbols. That could be the colors, the amarillo.
Mm-hmm.
That could be, a sacred item. That could be an artifact, a cowboy hat that they always wore and identified with. Their linear rationality may fade, but their symbolic rationality is always there. You can always take advantage of that. So I was giving this talk, and I was being quite critical of the Western idea that, well, somehow, if you're not a moral agent and you're not rational and intact cognitively, then you really don't count so much. Sort of like the Germans in the World War II said people with dementia were life unworthy of life, useless eaters, and so forth, because from a strictly utilitarian economic viewpoint, they're not contributing, if you will. So this fellow came in the back of the conference center. There were about 200 people there,
Mm-hmm.
Hindu neurologists, Hindu philosophers. And after I was done, he put his hand down on the table and he said, "You're absolutely right. There's no justification for thinking less of the moral status of someone who is deeply forgetful than someone who is perfectly memory capacitated." And that was His Holiness. So
Mm.
the Dalai Lama endorsed this book very nicely, and he says that it's consciousness that really matters
Mm.
in terms of morals and ethics. That if they can enjoy that color, those leaves, those musical sounds, that creativity, they're conscious beings, and they're still worthy of our concern.
Right, right. Well, no, we're going to get back to that toward the end of the program. I want to talk more about that. But before we do, I just wanted to shift a little bit to the clinical side of it, because you've mentioned to me and that, that dementia is a complicated disease. And I think that one of your colleagues, Peter Whitehouse, wrote a book on the myth of Alzheimer's, and it was controversial at the time. And he objected and said, well, it's not controversial. It's basically just acknowledging that it's not a singular condition caused by a singular problem. And one of the things that you talk about that sort of links a lot of your thoughts is about the impact of things like stress or perhaps even environmental pollution as a potential contributor. Talk about that a little bit, Stephen.
So about 15 years ago, I went to a conference at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, of really premier neurologists. Only 15 or 20 of them were invited, and I was a good listener and made some comments and wrote a paper with them. But at that point, they were just coming around to acknowledge that stress is one factor in the origins of Alzheimer's disease for any given individual. It's not just maybe a susceptibility gene. It's not just aging, which is always a contributory factor, but it can be many things, of which stress is one. Because when you look at protracted stress, when people are stressed out in this age of anxiety, WHO in the age of anxiety, they're under, their stress hormones tend to be high. And if that goes on for a long period of time, they tend to have vascular difficulties. There's a wonderful book called Anger Kills by Virginian and Robert Redfield of Duke. They tend to get vascular coagulation. They also tend to have slower wound healing by just, 10% or so. But also there's something called hippocampal atrophy. So the hippocampus, which is in the deep emotional part of the brain, it's the part of the brain that lays down short-term memories and also reacts to stress and fear. And so when you are under high stress hormones for long periods of time, you see atrophy in the hippocampus, and that's one of the 2 or 3 hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. So, well, maybe it's stress disease too.
Right. Yeah. Yes, that sort of dis-ease, the actual, there's a discomfort that's caused by stress. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
By the way,
And
100 years ago, dementia wasn't much caused by Alzheimer's because people weren't living that long. And what was causing dementia, which is a syndrome, a cluster of symptoms? Neurosyphilis. There were no antibiotics. There was a lot of syphilis around, and that's what was causing dementia. It's also dementia secondary to Parkinson's, secondary to chronic traumatic encephalitis, concussions, and the like. So Alzheimer's probably contributes maybe to 50% of the cases of dementia, but it's usually combined with small stroke events in the white matter of the brain, with other factors, including, by the way, as some of my colleagues now believe, lead. They actually think that lead poisoning may contribute to Alzheimer's disease. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. 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 So that's what you were mentioning, the sort of the environmental factors that could contribute to it. That kind of toxicity or pollution. Yeah, there's just a lot we don't know, and so I think your open mind is important in terms of this, and then linking the stress, going back and circling back to the impact on sort of giving and kindness. So you've done a lot of work in positive psychology as it relates to de-stressing, but also in a proactive way. So let's talk a little bit about that. And that's I guess also part of your work with Sir John Templeton and the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. Again, not in that broader notion of love, not hedonic love, but the many kinds of love that you talk about.
Absolutely. I do believe that love is the ultimate reality.
Okay, like that.
Now, Sir John Templeton, who was a mentor for me, believed that too. And in fact, when he was dying, he got to me a week or so before he passed away through his son, Jack Templeton, who was a pediatric trauma surgeon at CHOP in Philadelphia. And Jack called me and he said, "Dad wants you to do him a favor. He's dying and there's a book he wants to write that he's not going to have time to write, but he wants you to do it." And I said, "Oh my goodness, that's quite a challenge. Did he give you a title?" And he said, "Yes. Ultimate reality is unlimited love." And I said, "Jack, could you go back to your dad and say, can we get a question mark, please?" So Jack came back a couple of minutes later and he said, "Yeah, is ultimate reality unlimited love?" And, there are a lot of physicists, quantum physicists, who do think that somehow there is this incredibly mysterious energy underlying the universe as we know it, that somehow is behind the thermodynamic constants that give rise to a generative planet or a generative universe. That somehow life isn't just like an English still life portrait, but it's a buzzing, disappearing, reappearing set of particles that really express an energy that is absolutely profound and possibly an energy of love. So that's what Sir John believed. And so I did write that book for the Templeton Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
But so I was sitting in my office. I was at Case Medical School for 20 years, and it's 2000. And I've run around with Sir John doing all these things on positive psychological notions like kindness, gratitude, forgiveness, wisdom, and the like, and helping to fund big projects in these areas at major universities. And so I got a fax from Sir John, who lived in Lyford Key, which is in the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he didn't email, Ron. It wasn't his thing. But Sir John believed that the fax machine was the coolest invention ever, even more than the automobile. So sometimes you could get 10 or 12 faxes from Sir John, and you had to respond to them. So I got a fax one morning. I remember it was bright and sunny. I was sitting in my office, and it said, "We need to start an institute to study the greatest human experience, the greatest human asset available to us." And I faxed back, "Sir John, what's that?" And he said, "Unlimited love." And then he would say, not just human love, which is a little bit unsteady and sometimes unwise and
Mm-hmm.
can easily be reversed into hate, but he said, the love that made humans.
Mm.
That was Sir John. And he said, the love that heals. And he said, the love that allows us to discover our deeper selves. And so then I faxed back. I said, "Sir John," because I was at Case Medical School and I was actually doing genetics research on Alzheimer's.
Wow.
And I did wonder a little bit what my buddies would have to say.
Right.
So I faxed back, "Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism." Because, altruism is a very dry, sciencey term, and it's more acceptable.
Right.
But it is dry. So he faxed back, "No, I think unlimited love, up to $8.9 million. And I faxed back just what you would have faxed back, Ron. "Sir John, I love that language. It jumps right off the page." And we were off and running. And we funded, we still fund things.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually funding a big national survey right now about love and caregivers for the deeply forgetful, and how many times they've experienced in their loved one those moments of lucidity and what that meant to them. Did it bring them more alive in their caregiving? Did they begin to feel the value of what they were doing? That they begin to feel more loving as a result?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have that, but it's going to come out in the next half year, and I think it's going to hit the headlines.
Mm-hmm.
So we study love. We studied it in so many respects, and we continue to do so. And that is my passion.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Yeah, and my passion is doing shows like this, and we're actually coming to a close, unfortunately. But we'll have to have you come back for another show. So, Stephen, it's been a real pleasure having you here. And before we go, I wanted to mention to people that how they can get in touch with you. Just a slight correction. I realized you mentioned to me during a previous break that your website is stephengpost@gmail.com. That's STEPHENG post at well, that's your .com is the website, and you can reach it by just emailing you at that Gmail address.
Yes.
Anyway, I want to thank you again, and folks, you can tell your friends if you missed my conversation with Dr. Post today, you can listen to it as a podcast on voiceamerica.com. Just search for my show, 45 Forward. You can listen to it on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or roelresources.com. Just click on the 45 Forward tab. So be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'll be talking with Dr. Jay Baruch, professor of emergency medicine at Brown University's Albert Medical School. And he'll be talking about his life's work as a practicing emergency physician, writer, medical educator, and accidental academic. So until then, folks, keep moving forward, 45 forward.